Hey, so I look a little rough right now because I just woke up, but I decided to do another day in the life video just because I had gotten a lot of comments about how I filmed my entire day, but I didn't actually talk about what I did during the day. And now that I'm a few weeks into my job, I think I can have a better explanation as to what exactly I do all day, what kind of things I do as a software engineer at Microsoft. Obviously not giving away any company details, but just a general idea as to how I spend my day and how I spend my time. So what I end up doing is I check my emails. In my first couple of weeks, I mostly did a lot of onboarding and training. So there were a few sessions that I went to, and it was more so Microsoft sessions versus just my organization. I'd go to those sessions and they talked about things like benefits. They talked about Microsoft culture. We all got together, asked a bunch of questions for the project that we'll be working on, as well as just met new team members. I've been setting up a lot of coffee chats with people, so that's been really nice to see who's on the team and kind of what their function is. To go from a company where there's 8,500 employees at the headquarters to 180,000 employees all around the world, it's a big change. After I check my emails, basically all I'm gonna do is work on the ticket that I was assigned. I'm also doing some testing, so these two tasks will help me get more familiarized with the actual code base, but it takes time to kind of piece that domain knowledge together and then also apply it to that implementation process. So yeah, I mean, I guess I could do like a time lapse, right? That's what people do in day of the lives. I could start typing away, or at least pretend that I'm doing something important and then film it. So here we go. Kind of wanted to have a change of scenery. I'm just sitting in the living room right now. I figured it'd be nicer for you guys to also just see a different space other than me sitting at my desk or me on the couch. So I guess a little bit more about what I do as a software engineer in general, and this is kind of a conglomerate of my experiences at Microsoft, Target, and CUNA Mutual. The specific technologies themselves were very different, and the frameworks as well as the way that we deploy things in our CI/CD process. What was similar between all of the companies was the kind of tasks that we had to complete in order to make sure that our application was production ready. So when first starting out on a project, typically what I would do is gather all the business requirements. It's really important that you have the right communication skills, that you can actually have a conversation with the business and talk about exactly what needs to be done in order for the application to be successful. After you gather those requirements, it's really helpful to also design what your app is going to look like. Now, for me, I'm not a UI developer. I mostly work on the back end, so I never really had to deal with how the front end looked. I always dealt with what the APIs were gonna look like, how we were gonna transfer data to and from the UI. So for example, we did use something like HTTP protocol in one of my jobs, and that's a pretty standard process. It's a request and response model. I also use something such as Kafka for streaming, and that's more real-time data. So think like using a GPS. Your location isn't going to be updated based on sending a request and a response to and from the client and server. It's just going to continuously update. We kind of had to use those considerations when we were building out our application. Decided to make some Ube Mochi Pancakes. So I don't know why this knife is here, but yeah, I'm not mixing the wet ingredients first. Shoot me. Has this kind of purple color. Ube is actually a Filipino purple yam that are known in the Philippines, and they're basically used in jams, cakes, candies, and ice cream. Now apparently pancakes and waffles. Look at those bubbles. So it ended up being a little bit more blue than purple. Have my maple syrup. It's organic Vermont, excuse me, organic Vermont maple syrup from Trader Joe's, just like the Ube. One shot for this. So let's make it a good one. After we've figured out like the design, the requirements from the business, and then also what we want our microservices to look like, we also obviously have to talk about the database storage. You know, are we going to be using NoSQL or SQL? And all of this conversation might remind you of any of your system design interviews. This is pretty similar to a system design interview. When you're first architecting your system, you have to take a lot of things into consideration, especially how large your application will be and how many requests it'll be receiving. That part is really important to understand how to scale your application. Now, of course, at the time, I was just a lowly junior engineer, so I didn't really plan all of the project, but I did have a lot of say in the direction that the project went, and I did change a lot of architectural practices that we had based on my research. So for me, I really value companies that value you. So I know I was new, but if you have valuable information or insights based on your own research, or like if you create a POC, you guys, that's really helpful. So a POC is a proof of concept. And if you create one and you show it to your team, it's a more legitimate way of showing like, hey, this is the idea that I had and I actually built it in a proof of concept to show you that it does work. After you've actually designed the microservices, the data storage, the way that you're going to be transferring data, basically what you have to do is start to plan the implementation process. So for me, when I was helping to plan out a project, we would have different milestones that we would break the project up into. Obviously, there's a deadline that you're trying to hit, so try to keep your milestones within that deadline. But from experience, a lot of these deadlines are never met. It's more of a guiding point, and honestly, it's okay if you don't always hit that guiding point, unless it's some, you know, healthcare software or something that's really detrimental to a person's life. So after getting those milestones, we would break those milestones down into particular stories or features. So you would have stories or like sub-tasks, depending on how big your feature would be. So one example is building out an entire endpoint end-to-end might be one story, but because of the nature of the size of the application, building out your repository layer, your controller, your service layer, and then also creating mocks for your unit tests and your integration tests, as well as creating those functional tests. One endpoint may become a disaster of a pull request. If you've ever gone through thousands of lines of code in one pull request, you know exactly what I mean. So having that experience, I guess, to really understand how to break apart stories so it's not overwhelming, but also so that it's not just a quick bug fix to the point where you're spending more time actually creating your pull request versus actually implementing code. So once you've revised all your stories and you get started on it, there's a lot of hype, I guess, towards agile development and, you know, working in 2-week sprints. I've worked with sprints. I've done a lot of sprint planning as well. I've also worked in a Kanban environment, which I prefer Kanban, but I can see how it has its faults. It's a little less organized, and there's virtually like no organization or micromanaging with Kanban, just because you as the developer are the owner of the stories that you take up. So you're kind of expected to lay out your own path. And I think for more experienced developers, that's a great way to go. It's like, I don't want to be bothered by people who are micromanaging me, telling me exactly what to do all the time. But for people who are newer, and at that time I was newer to the industry, I think it would have been a little bit more helpful to have guidance. So it really is team dependent as to how they plan out stories, how they plan sprints, if they even use Agile. WaterFall used to be something that teams used back in the day. And I don't know if you guys know the difference between like waterfall and being agile, but essentially the difference is with waterfall, you would lay out all your business requirements and then you would just develop it and then hope that it would get done at the timeline that was asked of you. In order to be agile, you need to implement sprint planning into your monthly routine and quarterly planning. You have things like retros. Basically, every 2 weeks, you kind of reevaluate how everything is going. You go through all of the stories that exist in your backlog and you organize it based on priority, based on the amount of time you think it'll take, and the whole team participates in this. And then you also kind of reevaluate the current stories that you're working on. The idea is to get your stories done within those 2 weeks, but if you don't, then again, you just reevaluate. It's a very iterative process, and that's where that word is kind of overused as well. I've heard pros and cons. I know some people overuse those buzzwords, so I can understand why sometimes it's lost its luster in a lot of teams, but for me, I prefer Kanban. Once I'm more experienced as an engineer, I think I would prefer to kind of shift towards that way, at least for smaller projects. If you're working at NASA or at an organization that requires a lot of overhead, a lot of like security compliance, things that need to be done to a T, and there's not as much creativity involved, but more so process, then I would say Agile is very helpful. Hopefully you guys aren't getting whiplash from me moving around so much. I just figured it'd be a little bit more exciting for me to just move to different places. Okay, so I'm getting a little bit more casual now, just holding the phone up. Hopefully it makes it a little bit more conversational. But one more thing I wanted to add was, besides the waterfall and the agile rant I just went on, after you're done architecting and planning out your milestones, or per se your epic, as well as breaking down your stories, then comes the implementation process. So my typical day, once I'm actually done planning everything out, would just look like taking on a story, and a story may take 1 day, it may take 5 days. It's really dependent on how big it is. And what I would do is then make sure that all of the business requirements are listed in the summary. And if not, I'll just spend time talking to someone who created the story. If it was me and I'm too ambiguous in the way that I actually created the story in the first place, then I'll just go talk to someone that represents the business and have a conversation about exactly what they want that to look like. Then I'll go ahead and start developing in my integrated development environment of choosing, IDE for short, and then I'll get started on coding everything. And a lot of times that requires research. Sometimes that research requires understanding parts of the language that you're using if you're new to the language. For example, I used Kotlin, which is a JVM language. So if you know Java, it's pretty easy to then get started with Kotlin, but there's a lot of other aspects to Kotlin that are different. So for example, there's a heavy emphasis on functional programming, although Java 8 also has functional programming, but Kotlin, there's a heavier emphasis on it. Also learning a new framework, for example, like understanding what dependency injection is and using that within the Micronaut framework was something new to me. So doing that background research, implementing the story, putting in your unit tests, your integration tests, your functional tests, manually testing it, and then eventually deploying it in your stage environment, manually testing it in your stage environment, and then deploying it in your prod environment and making sure that the right metrics are in place so that you're actually able to monitor whether or not things go wrong. And then also obviously testing in your prod environment. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you liked it. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Bye.